He built a billion-dollar empire, saving children nobody else would touch. Then, at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday, 2 patient files landed on his desk with a name that made him forget how to breathe. Rena Emmons, the woman he'd left alone in a hospital room 15 years ago, pregnant, begging him to stay. He'd walked out with his car keys already in his hand, telling her the clinic was more important. She'd raised the twins by herself, working 3 jobs, never cashing his guilt check. And now those boys, 13 years old, scared, and desperate for the only medical care in the state that could help them, were sitting in his waiting room, asking their mother one question: "Is the doctor safe?" Neither one knowing the man about to review their files was the father who'd chosen strangers over them. It was 11:43 p.m. His office on the 8th floor of Fisher Youth Health was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of his leather chair. Mahogany desk, glass of water sweating onto a coaster. A stack of case files waiting for review before tomorrow's board meeting. Paul had been doing this for 15 years, reading files, approving treatment plans, ensuring every child who walked through his doors got the care they deserved. But he never read names. That was rule number 1. Names complicated things. Names led to faces. Faces led to stories. And stories interfered with objectivity. He reviewed by number, by symptom cluster, by risk index, by protocol, cold, clinical, effective, until file J3147 and H3B148. Twin intake, same address, same insurance provider, same emergency contact, and one name that made the air leave his lungs so fast he thought for one dizzy second that he might die at his desk. Emergency contact, Rena Emmons. His hand froze mid-page. The file corners bent slightly under the pressure of his grip. He blinked, read it again. The letters didn't change. Rena Emmons. He hadn't heard that name in 15 years. Hadn't allowed himself to think it. Hadn't dared to wonder what became of her after he walked away. But here it was, printed neatly in 12-point font, right there in the emergency contact field of 2 case files for transgender youth seeking gender-affirming care. Paul's throat tightened. He forced himself to keep reading. Patient J3147. Joseph Emmons. Age 13. Assigned female at birth. Identifies as male. Interests include theater, painting, and digital design. Socially transitioned at age 12. Seeking hormone blockers and therapeutic support. Patient H3148. Henry Emmons. Age 13. Assigned male at birth. Identifies as non-binary, trans-masculine. Interests include poetry, creative writing, and spoken word. Socially transitioned at age 12. Seeking hormone blockers and therapeutic support. Twin boys, 13 years old. Born minutes apart, according to the intake notes. Raised side by side. Both transgender. Both seeking care from the clinic Paul built. Both with Rena's name listed as their mother. Paul pressed his palms flat against the desk. His heart hammered against his ribs. His vision blurred at the edges. 15 years ago, Rena had stood in a hospital room alone, one hand pressed to her stomach, the other clutching an ultrasound printout. He could still see it. Twin A, Twin B. 2 grainy shapes on glossy paper. She'd looked at him with those steady brown eyes, the ones that had always seen through his carefully constructed speeches, the ones that never let him hide. And she'd said, "I need you." And he'd said, "I can't do both." "The timing isn't right," he'd told her. "The clinic needs me. This could change everything. I have to focus. I can't be distracted. I can't afford complications." He hadn't said children. He'd said complications. She hadn't cried. She'd just nodded once. A single, decisive movement. Then she'd said, "Then don't." And he'd left. He'd walked out of that hospital room, with his keys already in his hand, his mind already shifting to the funding meeting he had the next morning, the interview scheduled for Thursday, the grant application due by the end of the month. He'd told himself it was the right choice, the necessary choice. The clinic could save thousands of children. His personal life was a footnote. Rena had left with a suitcase, a settlement check she never cashed, and 2 heartbeats growing inside her. Paul had built an empire dedicated to helping children like the ones he never knew existed. Now those children's files were on his desk. He flipped back to the therapist's notes. Dr. Sarah Mehta had conducted the intake 3 months ago. Joseph. Consistent, persistent, insistent. Patient demonstrates clear and sustained gender dysphoria. Highly articulate about identity. Expresses frustration with physical presentation. States, I don't want to disappear just to make other people comfortable. Paul's breath caught. Henry. Quieter presentation, but equally consistent. Patient journals extensively. Submitted writing samples as part of intake. Expresses desire for body autonomy. States, I don't hate my body. I just want it to listen to me. Paul read those lines 3 times. Joseph's words bold and defiant. Henry's quieter, but no less certain. Different handwriting styles in the journal excerpts attached to the digital files. Joseph's loose and sprawling. Henry's tighter, more cautious. 2 boys, his boys. Children he didn't know. Lives he'd missed entirely. He'd built protocols for this, advocated for children whose parents rejected them, spoken on stages about unconditional care, testified before legislative committees about the life-saving necessity of gender-affirming health care, written op-eds, fought insurance companies, stood in hospital boardrooms and demanded better. And yet, the most radical truth confronted him now, sitting alone in his office at midnight. He had abandoned his own. Paul leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked. The water glass on his desk had left a ring. Outside, the city lights blinked against the dark. He couldn't review these cases. It would be unethical. A conflict of interest so blatant it could destroy his credibility, endanger his clinic, undermine everything he'd built. But he couldn't ignore them either. They were his sons. Children who shared his blood, his genetic code, half of their DNA. Children who had lived 13 years without him. Children who had struggled with something profound and fundamental about their own identities, while he stood on stages and talked about other people's children. Paul picked up his phone. His hands were shaking. He scrolled to his chief medical officer's contact. Elaine Johansson. Competent, discreet, someone he trusted. It was 12:07 a.m. He called anyway. She answered on the 3rd ring, voice thick with sleep. Paul, what's wrong? I need you to flag 2 files for secondary review, he said. His voice sounded strange, hollow, like it belonged to someone else. J3147 and 83148. Conflict of interest. Silence on the other end. Then, carefully, what kind of conflict? Paul closed his eyes. They're my sons. The words hung in the air. He'd never said them out loud before. Never had reason to. Never had the right to. Elaine inhaled sharply. Paul, I didn't know, he interrupted. I didn't know they existed. Their mother and I... It ended 15 years ago, before they were born. I need you to take over their care plan. I'll recuse myself from any medical decisions, but I need to be informed. I need to know they're getting what they need. Does their mother know you're aware? Not yet. Another pause. Paul, this is... I know. She's going to have to be notified. Protocol requires disclosure of any conflict that might affect care. I know, he said again. I'll call her in 3 days. Give you time to... I don't know. Prepare. There's no preparing for this, Elaine. No, she agreed quietly. I suppose there isn't. They hung up. Paul sat in the dark. The files were still open on his desk. Joseph's face in the attached photo. School picture, probably. Short hair. Confident smile. Eyes that looked startlingly like Paul's own brother, Danny. Henry's photo beside it. Softer expression. Quieter. Hair longer, pushed behind one ear. A slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Paul had missed everything. First steps, first words, first days of school, first heartbreaks, first moments of clarity, when they realized something fundamental about themselves. First times they'd voiced it out loud. He'd built this clinic because of Danny, his younger brother, 14 years old when he'd told Paul, voice shaking, "I think I'm supposed to be a girl." Paul had been 16, terrified. He'd told their parents, thinking they'd help, thinking they'd know what to do. Their father had sent Danny to conversion therapy. Danny had died by suicide 6 months later. Paul had found the journal Danny left behind. One line underlined 3 times in shaky handwriting. Nobody stayed. At Danny's funeral, Paul had made a promise at the graveside. He'd been 17, drowning in a suit that was too big, tie choking him. He'd whispered the words into the cold November air. "I'll stay. For every kid like you, I swear." And he had. For 30 years, he'd stayed. He'd built Fisher Youth Health from nothing, fought for funding, advocated for policy changes, became the loudest voice for children nobody else would defend. But when his own children needed him, before they even existed, he'd walked away. The irony was so sharp, it cut. In 3 days, Elaine would call Rena. And Rena would know that Paul knew. That after 15 years of silence, of absence, of building monuments to his guilt, without even understanding what he'd lost, he'd finally seen their names. Joseph, Henry, his sons. The question wasn't whether they'd let him into their lives. The question was whether he deserved to ask. Whether showing up 15 years late to a story that had been written without him meant anything at all. Whether presence could ever compensate for absence. Whether fatherhood was something you earned or something you simply tried to become even when you had no right to. Paul closed the files, turned off his desk lamp, sat in the darkness of his office on the 8th floor, surrounded by plaques and awards and framed articles about the visionary doctor who saved children. And for the first time in his life, success felt like ash. You know, stories like this, about parents who abandon their children and then have to face what they've done. They don't get told enough. If you've ever had to reckon with someone who walked away, or if you've been the one who left, this story might feel like it's yours too. Subscribe, because we're just getting started. And trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back. Back to the moment Rana first brought her sons to that clinic. Back to the day she had no idea she was about to walk into the building her ex built. Back to the moment when everything changed, even though she didn't know it yet. 3 months earlier, Rena sat in a waiting room that smelled like lavender and lies, holding 2 intake forms she could barely read through the tears she refused to let fall. She was sandwiched between Joseph and Henry on a couch that was trying too hard to be comfortable. Joseph to her left, knee bouncing like a jackhammer, nervous energy radiating off him in waves. Henry to her right, hands folded in his lap, staring at his fingernails like they held answers to questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. Fisher Youth Health, the only comprehensive gender-affirming clinic for minors in the entire state. The only place that would see them without requiring a referral from a pediatrician who didn't believe them, or a therapist who wanted to explore other possibilities first, or a psychiatrist who thought maybe they just needed more time. They'd been on the waiting list for 6 months, since the boys were 12. Rena had called every week for the first 3 months just to make sure they hadn't been forgotten, hadn't slipped through some administrative crack. The receptionist had been kind but firm. "We see every child on our list, Mrs. Emmons. I promise. We just have more kids who need us than we have hours in the day." Rena looked around the waiting room. Soft blue walls, framed art prints, abstract, colorful, nothing too specific or gendered. A low table with magazines, a bowl of dum-dums on the reception desk, the kind with the white sticks and brightly colored wrappers. Joseph had already gotten up twice to grab candy, cherry the first time. Now he was unwrapping a second one, green apple, while his leg continued its relentless rhythm against the carpet. Henry hadn't moved, just sat there, still and quiet, the way he did when he was trying to take up less space, when he was trying to disappear without actually leaving. She had no idea whose building she was sitting in. Joseph Emmons? Henry Emmons? A woman appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, kind face, name tag that read Dr. Sarah Maida. Rena stood. The boys followed. They were led down a hallway that smelled like fresh paint and new carpet. Dr. Maida's office was small but warm. 2 chairs for the boys, one for Rena slightly behind them. A desk with a computer, a cup of pens, a framed photo of a golden retriever. "So," Dr. Maida said, settling into her chair and smiling at the boys. "Tell me about yourselves. What do you like to do?" Joseph sat up straighter. "I paint, and I'm in the drama club at school. I want to study design, like set design or costumes or something. I like making things look the way they're supposed to look." "That's wonderful," Dr. Maida said, typing notes. "And you, Henry?" Henry's voice was softer. "I write. Poetry, mostly. Some short stories. I do spoken word sometimes at open mics, when I'm brave enough." "That takes a lot of courage," Dr. Maida said. "I'd love to read some of your work, if you're willing to share." Henry nodded, a small smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. Dr. Maida leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting to something more intentional. "I want to ask you both something important. When did you first know? About your gender, I mean. When did you first realize that the identity people assigned to you didn't fit?" Joseph didn't hesitate. "I've always known. I just didn't have words for it. Like when I was little, I'd get so angry when people called me a girl. I didn't know why it made me so mad. I just knew it felt wrong, like someone was calling me by the wrong name over and over, even though I kept correcting them." Henry took longer to answer. "It felt like everyone else got an instruction manual, and I got a different book entirely. Like everyone around me knew exactly how to be the thing they were supposed to be, and I was just guessing, getting it wrong, watching myself in mirrors and wondering why the person looking back didn't match what I felt inside." Rena's throat tightened. She'd heard them say these things before, late at night in the kitchen, or in the car on the way to school, or in whispered conversations she wasn't supposed to overhear. But hearing them say it here, in this room, to this doctor who was writing it all down and nodding like it made perfect sense, it made it real, in a way it hadn't been before. Dr. Maida asked more questions about school, about friends, about how they felt in their bodies, about what they hoped treatment might help them with. Joseph was animated, gestured with his hands, talked about wanting to feel comfortable in his own skin, about not wanting to dread puberty, about wanting to look in the mirror and recognize himself. Henry was quieter, but no less clear. He talked about wanting his body to cooperate, about not hating it, but not feeling at home in it either, about wanting to stop feeling like a guest in his own life. What Rena didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the man who founded this clinic had walked away from her 15 years earlier. That every protocol, every policy, every safeguard Paul Fisher built was penance for a sin he didn't even know he'd committed. But that reckoning was coming. The appointment lasted 90 minutes. At the end, Dr. Maida smiled at both boys. "You're both incredibly articulate and self-aware. I'm going to recommend that we move forward with a treatment plan that includes therapy and, when you're ready, puberty blockers. We'll take it one step at a time. You're in control here. This is your journey." Joseph exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for months. Henry's shoulders dropped an inch. Relief, visible and immediate. Afterward, Rena sat in her car in the parking lot. Engine off. Joseph in the passenger seat. Henry in the back. Both of them quiet now. The adrenaline fading into something softer. Rena gripped the steering wheel with both hands. Stared through the windshield at the building they'd just left. Fisher Youth Health. 8 stories of glass and steel. A place that had just told her sons they were seen. That they were believed. That they weren't broken. "Whatever happens," she said, voice steady even though her hands were shaking, "I'm with you, both of you, forever." Joseph reached forward from the passenger seat and squeezed her shoulder, his hand warm and solid and real. Henry leaned forward from the back seat. "We know, Mom." Rena started the car, pulled out of the parking lot, drove home through streets that looked the same as they had that morning, but somehow felt different. Like the world had shifted slightly on its axis, and she was the only one who'd noticed. She didn't know that in 3 months, her son's files would land on a desk she'd spent 15 years trying to forget. That the man who'd abandoned her would read Joseph's words. "I don't want to disappear just to make other people comfortable." And Henry's words, "I just want my body to listen to me and finally understand what he'd lost." The intake was approved. The boys would begin therapy, and in 3 months, their files would land on a desk Rena never wanted to see again. But Paul Fisher's story didn't begin the night he saw those files. It began 30 years ago, when he decided to dedicate his life to children nobody else wanted to save. The question is, why? Paul Fisher built his empire on one belief, that children deserve adults who show up. The irony would eventually destroy him. Pay attention to why he built this. It explains everything that happens next. The story begins 30 years earlier. Paul Fisher, at 16 years old, sitting on the edge of his bed at 2 in the morning, listening to his younger brother cry through the wall that separated their bedrooms. Danny was 14, small for his age, quiet in the way that made teachers forget he existed and bullies remember he was there. He'd knocked on Paul's door that night, eyes red, hands shaking, and said the words that would change both of their lives. "I think I'm supposed to be a girl." Paul had frozen. He was 16. He didn't know what to say, didn't know what it meant, didn't know how to help. So he did what teenagers do when they're terrified and out of their depth. He told their parents. He thought they'd help, thought they'd know what to do, thought maybe there was a doctor or a therapist or someone who could explain this, who could make Danny feel less alone. Their father sent Danny to conversion therapy instead. 3 sessions a week. A church basement that smelled like mildew and shame. A man with kind eyes and cruel convictions who told Danny that what he felt was a sickness. That prayer could fix it. That God didn't make mistakes, so Danny must be choosing this. Danny stopped talking after the 2nd week, stopped eating after the 4th, moved through the house like a ghost, transparent and weightless and already halfway gone. 6 months later, Paul found him in the bathroom. The details don't matter. The aftermath does. Paul found Danny's journal 3 days after the funeral. hidden under the mattress, pages and pages of careful handwriting, poems, sketches, prayers to a God who didn't seem to be listening. And on the last page, one line underlined 3 times, in shaky letters. Nobody stayed. Paul read those words at 17 years old, standing in his dead brother's bedroom, and something inside him cracked clean through. The funeral was November. Cold enough that Paul's breath fogged in the air. He wore a suit that was too big, borrowed from a cousin. Sleeves too long, shoulders too wide. The tie felt like it was strangling him. At the graveside, after everyone else had left, Paul knelt in the dead grass and whispered a promise into the wind. "I'll stay. For every kid like you. I swear." 20 years of work followed that promise. Medical school. Paul buried himself in textbooks and clinical rotations and research papers. Residency in adolescent medicine. He worked 100-hour weeks, slept in on-call rooms, drank coffee that tasted like regret and determination in equal measure. Fellowships in gender-affirming care, a field so new it barely had language yet, let alone protocols. He studied under pioneers, read every paper, attended every conference, became an expert in something most doctors refused to acknowledge existed. At 38, he opened Fisher Youth Health, 1 floor at first, 3 exam rooms, a waiting area he painted himself. He fought insurance companies who wouldn't cover the care, lobbied legislators who didn't want to hear about transgender children, testified at hearings where people called him a monster to his face. He didn't care. He became the loudest voice for children nobody else would defend. The clinic grew, 2 floors, then 4, then 8. National recognition, invited to speak at conferences, quoted in medical journals. The visionary doctor who built the only comprehensive gender-affirming clinic for minors in the state. But he was relentless, obsessive. The clinic wasn't just his work. It was his life, his penance. His promise kept over and over again. Relationships didn't survive his schedule. Girlfriends who got tired of canceled dinners. Friends who stopped calling because he never called back. A life that revolved entirely around other people's children, while his own remained theoretical, distant, impossible. Until Rena. They met at a fundraiser, one of those black tie events where wealthy people wrote checks and felt good about themselves. Paul was the keynote speaker. He'd given the speech 100 times, statistics about suicide rates, stories about children saved, a carefully crafted narrative about hope and possibility. Rena was at the bar afterward, grant writer for a nonprofit, navy dress, hair pulled back. She looked at him with eyes that didn't buy a single word he'd said. "You're performing," she told him. "Excuse me? You're very good, but it's still a performance." Paul should have been offended. Instead, he fell in love with her honesty. She saw through him, saw past the polished speeches and the carefully maintained image, saw the man underneath, the one who was still 17 years old, still kneeling at a graveside, still trying to save a brother who was already gone. They dated for 2 years. She made him laugh, made him leave the office before midnight, made him remember that life existed outside the clinic walls. She was smart and calm and unimpressed by his accomplishments in the best possible way. When she got pregnant, Paul panicked. Here's what Paul told himself. The clinic couldn't survive a scandal, an unplanned pregnancy, a complicated personal life. He needed to be pristine, uncomplicated, fundable. But what he really meant was, he was afraid. Afraid of failing, afraid of being human, afraid of staying. The hospital room was small, white walls, fluorescent lights that made everything look too sharp. Rena sat on the exam table, 12 weeks along, one hand pressed to her stomach. An ultrasound printout on the chair beside her. Twin A, twin B. Two grainy shapes that would become Joseph and Henry. I can't do this in the clinic, Paul said. Keys already in his hand. Exit already planned. Then choose, Rena replied. Steady, clear, already knowing what he'd decided. He did. He chose the clinic, chose the work, chose the promise he'd made to a dead brother over the future he could have had with a living family. He left, walked out of that hospital room, and told himself it was the right choice, the necessary choice, that the clinic would save thousands of children and his personal life was a footnote, that he was serving a greater good. Rena never contacted him again. She didn't cash the settlement check he sent, didn't ask for help, didn't tell him when the twins were born, or what she named them, or what they looked like, or who they became. Paul told himself he made the right choice, that the clinic mattered more, that he was serving a greater good. For 15 years, he believed that, until the night two files made him realize he'd been building monuments to the children he abandoned. I think the hardest stories to hear are the ones where good people make terrible choices, where someone builds something beautiful and true, but does it on a foundation of betrayal? If this is hitting you somewhere deep, if you know what it's like to be abandoned by someone who claimed they were doing the right thing, leave a comment. Tell me you're not alone in this. And hit that like button if you're still with me, because this story is about to crack wide open. Rena got the call on a Tuesday afternoon. The woman on the phone said conflict of interest, but what Rena heard was he knows. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 months after the intake appointment. Rena was folding laundry in the living room, matching socks, smoothing out t-shirts, the mindless domestic rhythm that kept her hands busy and her thoughts quiet. Her phone buzzed on the arm of the couch. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Mrs. Emmons, this is Elaine Johansson, Chief Medical Officer at Fisher Youth Health. Rena's hands stilled mid-fold. Her stomach dropped. When clinics called unscheduled, it was never good news. Yes? I need to inform you that due to a conflict of interest, your son's files have been flagged for secondary review. The room tilted. Rena sat down hard on the couch, the laundry basket sliding off her lap, clean clothes spilling onto the floor. What conflict? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. A pause. Professional? Careful? The kind of pause that meant someone was choosing their words very deliberately. Our CEO has requested to personally oversee their case. He's recused himself from making medical decisions, but he's asked to be informed of their care plan. Silence. Rena's heart hammered so hard she could hear it in her ears. Why? Another pause. Longer this time. I believe that's a conversation you should have with him directly. Rena's hand started shaking. She gripped the phone tighter. Are you denying them care? No, Elaine said quickly. Absolutely not. Dr. Maida will continue as their primary physician. I'll be overseeing their treatment plan personally. Nothing changes in terms of their access to services. This is purely a disclosure requirement. We're legally obligated to inform you when there's a potential conflict that might affect care. But there isn't one, Rena said. You just said nothing changes. Medically, no. But ethically, we have to be transparent. Mrs. Emmons, your sons will receive the same standard of care as every other patient. I give you my word. What Rena decides in the next 5 minutes will change all 4 of their lives. When does he want to meet them? Rena asked. That's entirely up to you and your sons. He's made no demands. He simply wanted you to know that he knows. Rena closed her eyes. 15 years. 15 years of silence, of raising these boys alone, of building a life that didn't include Paul Fisher in any capacity. And now, he was back inserted into the most vulnerable moment of her sons' lives through sheer coincidence and the cruelty of fate. "I need to talk to them," Rena said. "Of course. Take all the time you need. If you decide you'd like a meeting, call me directly. If you'd prefer to transfer care to another provider, we can arrange that as well. Though, I'll be honest, we're the only clinic in the state that provides comprehensive gender-affirming care for minors." "I know," Rena said quietly. She hung up. The phone felt heavy in her hand. She set it down on the coffee table like it might explode. Her hands were shaking visibly now. She pressed them flat against her thighs, trying to steady herself, trying to breathe. Joseph and Henry were at the kitchen table, homework spread out between them. Math worksheets, history notes, the ordinary debris of ordinary teenage lives. They looked up when she walked in. "Mom?" Henry's voice, soft and worried. Rena pulled out a chair and sat down, folded her hands on the table, looked at both of her sons, 13 years old, growing into themselves, brave in ways she'd never had to be. Deep breath. "The man who runs the clinic is your biological father." Joseph's eyes widened. His pencil clattered onto the table. Henry went very still. That particular kind of stillness he had when he was processing something too big to react to immediately. "Did he know about us?" Joseph asked. "No." "Does he want to meet us?" Henry asked, quieter. "I don't know. The clinic called to tell me he knows. That he saw your files. He's not making your medical decisions. They've assigned someone else for that. But he asked to be informed about your care plan." Joseph leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Do we have to meet him?" "Absolutely not. This is your choice. All of it. This is what fierce love looks like. Not protecting them from the truth, but giving them the power to decide what happens next." Rena had spent 13 years making sure her sons knew they were enough. She wasn't about to let anyone, not even their father, make them question that. Joseph and Henry looked at each other. That twin thing they did sometimes, communicating in glances and micro-expressions that Rena couldn't quite read. Henry spoke first. "I want to meet him." Joseph looked at him, surprised. "Why?" "Because I want to know if he's safe." That word, safe. Not good, not sorry, not worth knowing. Safe. Henry needed to know if Paul Fisher was someone who would hurt them. If letting him into their lives would cause more damage than keeping him out. If the risk was worth taking. Joseph studied his brother's face, then nodded slowly. "Okay. Yeah. Me too." Rena wanted to say no. Wanted to wrap her arms around both of them and tell them they didn't owe Paul Fisher anything. Not their time, not their forgiveness, not even their curiosity. He'd walked away. He'd made his choice. They didn't have to give him a second one. But she'd learned a long time ago that protecting her children didn't mean making their choices for them. "Are you sure?" she asked. Both boys nodded. Rena picked up her phone, dialed the number Elaine Johansson had called from. "Mrs. Emmons?" Elaine answered on the second ring. "Set up a meeting, but I'm there the entire time. Of course, I'll coordinate with everyone and call you back with options for dates and times." Rena hung up again. Joseph reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Henry got up and hugged her from behind, his chin resting on top of her head, the way he did when he was little, and she was sad. "We're okay, Mom," Joseph said. "I know," Rena replied. "I just wish you didn't have to be." The meeting was scheduled for the following week. Paul had 7 days to figure out what to say to the children he abandoned. Rena had 7 days to decide if she could sit in the same room as the man who chose ambition over her. And Joseph and Henry had 7 days to prepare for the stranger who shared their blood, but none of their history. Paul didn't sleep for 6 of those 7 nights. Paul rewrote his introduction 47 times. Every version sounded like a lie. He sat in his office at 3 in the morning, the city dark outside his 8th floor window, a notepad in front of him, filled with crossed-out sentences that kept trying and failing to say something true. I'm sorry. Too simple. 2 words that couldn't possibly hold 15 years of absence. I made a mistake. Too clinical. Like he'd miscalculated a dosage or filed the wrong paperwork. Not abandoned 2 children before they were born. I was afraid. Too honest? Or not honest enough? He pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw stars. 5 days until the meeting. 5 days to figure out what to say to the children he'd never met, to the woman he'd walked away from, to the mirror he'd spent 15 years avoiding. Paul opened their files again. Not the medical notes this time, the supplementary materials, the things that made them human instead of case numbers. Joseph's art portfolio, submitted as part of intake. Self-portraits in bold colors, reds and oranges and electric blues. Each one showed a figure becoming more visible, more solid, more present. Like watching someone step out of fog into sunlight. Henry's poetry, pages of it, typed and handwritten. One poem titled The Body as a Rented Room. Paul read it 3 times, each line landing like a punch. He doesn't know them, but he recognizes them. Here's what Paul couldn't write down. That he saw Danny in both of them. That Joseph's boldness was Danny's dream. That Henry's quiet strength was what Danny never got to build. That this wasn't about redemption. It was about witnessing. About saying, I see you, even though I have no right to. The confrontation is 2 days away, and nobody's ready. Across town, Rena stood in front of her bedroom mirror at 6 in the morning, trying on her 3rd outfit. She'd settled on armor, navy blazer, white blouse. The silver necklace her mother had given her on her 30th birthday. Simple, elegant. A reminder that she came from women who survived difficult things. She practiced her posture, straight spine, level gaze, shoulders back, but not defensive. The stance of someone who had nothing to prove because she'd already done the work. She will not cry. She will not rage. She will be a wall. Her best friend Maya knocked on the door that evening, letting herself in the way she had for the past 13 years. She found Rena sitting on the couch, staring at nothing, hands folded too tightly in her lap. You don't have to be strong through this, Maya said, sitting beside her. Yes, I do. For them. Rena, they're not fragile. I know. But I am. Rena had spent 15 years convincing herself she didn't need Paul, that she was whole without him, and she was. But seeing him again meant confronting the girl she used to be, the one who loved him, the one he left, and that girl was still inside her, holding her breath. Down the hall, Joseph and Henry sat in their shared room. Joseph on his bed, phone in hand, scrolling through Paul Fisher's Wikipedia page for the 3rd time that week. He's testified before Congress, Joseph said. So? Henry replied from his desk, where he was pretending to do homework. So he's kind of a big deal. Not to us. Joseph set his phone down. Henry closed his journal, the one he'd been writing in, but not actually writing in, just staring at blank pages. I don't want to like him, Henry admitted quietly. Me neither, Joseph agreed. But what if we do? Silence. The kind that sits heavy between people who know each other too well to lie. Then we figure it out, Joseph said finally. The night before the meeting, Paul sent an email to Elaine at 11:53 p.m. Subject, tomorrow. Body, I don't know how to do this. Her response came 6 minutes later. Nobody does. Just show up. Paul didn't sleep. He watched the clock count down the hours, rehearsed sentences that all felt inadequate. Thought about Danny, thought about Rena, Thought about the twins whose lives had gone on perfectly fine without him, who didn't need him then and probably didn't need him now. Rena lay awake in her own bed, staring at the ceiling. Joseph and Henry were asleep down the hall. She'd checked twice, standing in their doorway like she did when they were babies, making sure they were breathing, making sure they were real. She thought about the ultrasound printout Paul never saw. Twin A, twin B, two grainy shapes on glossy paper that had become two whole people with opinions and art and poetry and questions about their own bodies. He missed all of it. First steps, first words, first days of school. First time Joseph cut his own hair in the bathroom with kitchen scissors. First note Henry left on her pillow, saying he didn't think he was a boy. First moments of clarity. First moments of fear. First moments of becoming. All of it. He missed all of it, and now he wanted to show up. The meeting was set for 2 p.m. Conference room C, neutral territory. Paul arrived 15 minutes early. Rena arrived exactly on time. And when Joseph and Henry walked through that door, all four of them would have to face the same question. Can you forgive someone who doesn't deserve it? And more importantly, should you? You know what's wild? Most of us spend our whole lives avoiding conversations like this. The hard ones. The ones where you have to sit across from someone who hurt you and decide if they get access to your life again. If you've ever had to make that choice, to let someone back in or to keep the door closed, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because what happens in that conference room, it's going to surprise all of us. The conference room smelled like recycled air and regret. Paul stood when they entered. That was his first mistake. It made him look like he was trying, and trying felt like manipulation. Conference room C smelled like recycled air and regret. Gray carpet, white walls, a long table with 6 chairs, a pitcher of water, and 4 glasses arranged with corporate precision. Neutral territory, Elaine had called it. But there was nothing neutral about this. Paul had arrived 15 minutes early. Sat, stood, sat again. Practiced opening lines that all sounded hollow. Finally settled on standing behind the table, hands clasped in front of him, like he was about to deliver a presentation. When the door opened, he stood straighter. Instinct, manners, the reflex of someone who'd spent 30 years performing professionalism. Rena entered first. Navy blazer, white blouse, silver necklace catching the fluorescent light. Her face was a mask, calm, composed, impenetrable. She looked exactly like she had 15 years ago, and nothing like her at all. Joseph and Henry flanked her. Matching heights now, though Joseph stood with his shoulders back, chin up, while Henry's posture was quieter, more guarded. Rena's hand rested on Henry's shoulder. Joseph's jaw was tight. Paul's hands hung at his sides, suddenly unsure where to put them. Sit, Rena said. They did. Rena in the center, the boys on either side of her, a united front. Paul lowered himself into the chair across from them, the table between them feeling simultaneously too wide and not wide enough. He opened his mouth. Rena cut him off. You don't get to speak first. Silence. Paul closed his mouth, nodded. Here's what's going to happen, Rena said, voice level and sharp as a scalpel. You're going to listen. You're not going to interrupt. You're not going to explain. You're not going to justify. When I'm done, Joseph and Henry will decide if they want to speak to you. If they don't, you leave. Understood? Yes, Paul said quietly. Rena's hands were folded on the table. Steady, no tremor, no tell. She looked at him the way you look at a stranger you're forced to deal with. Necessary but unwelcome. 15 years ago, you left me in a hospital room. I was 12 weeks pregnant. You said the clinic mattered more, that your work was bigger than us. I believed you. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't have a choice. I raised them alone. I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. I didn't cash your settlement check. I didn't need your money. I needed you. They needed you. But you chose a building. The words landed like stones. Paul felt each one. So here's what you don't get to do. You don't get to be their savior. You don't get to swoop in now and play father. You don't get to use them as proof that you've grown. If they let you into their lives, it's because they choose it. Not because you've earned it, because you haven't. Paul's eyes glistened. He blinked hard, kept his gaze steady on Rena's face. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like exactly what she'd just forbidden. An explanation, a justification, an excuse? Rena leaned back slightly, turned to Joseph and Henry. Your turn, if you want it. Joseph leaned forward, elbows on the table. I looked you up, he said, looking directly at Paul. You've helped a lot of kids. Kids like me and Henry. Paul nodded. That's good. That matters. But it doesn't change the fact that you weren't there for us. And honestly, I don't know if I want you there now. I don't know you. You're just a guy who shares DNA with me. Pause. Joseph's fingers drummed once against the table, then stilled. But, this is where everything shifts. Pay attention. Joseph continued. But Henry wants to meet you, and I want to support him. So I'm here. I'm listening. But don't think that means I've forgiven you. I don't, Paul said. I wouldn't expect. I wasn't finished, Joseph said. Paul went silent. You don't get to tell us how to feel. You don't get to make this easier by apologizing and moving on. If we let you in, it's going to be slow. And it's going to be on our terms, not yours. Understood, Paul said. Watch what Henry does next. It matters. Henry's voice was soft when he spoke, but it carried in the quiet room. I wrote a poem once called The Father I Never Met. It was about you. I didn't know your name or your face, but I knew you were out there. I used to imagine you were dead. It was easier that way, less painful than thinking you chose not to know us. Paul's breath caught audibly. When Mom told us you run this clinic, I was angry. Because you built this whole thing for kids like me, but you couldn't stay for me. That's messed up. Silence. Henry's hands were folded in his lap now, fingers interlaced tightly. But I also think maybe you were running from yourself, from your own fear. And I get that. I've been afraid my whole life. Afraid of my body. Afraid of how people see me. Afraid I'll never feel like myself. Henry looked directly at Paul for the first time. Their eyes met. Paul saw something in Henry's expression that reminded him so sharply of Danny it hurt. That particular combination of vulnerability and steel. Henry turned to Rena. Is he safe? Rena considered the question. Considered Paul. The silence stretched. I don't know, she answered honestly. Henry nodded, turned back to Paul. I want to know why you left. Not an excuse. The real reason? Paul's voice cracked when he spoke. I was terrified, not of being a father, of failing at it. My brother, his name was Danny, he died when I was 16. He was transgender. Our parents sent him to conversion therapy. He didn't survive it. I promised at his grave that I would stay for every kid like him, that I would build something that protected them. But when Rena told me she was pregnant, all I could think was, what if I mess this up? What if I fail you the way my parents failed Danny? So I ran. I chose the clinic because it was easier to save strangers than to risk failing you. I was a coward, and I'm sorry. The words came out raw, unpolished. Nothing like the 47 versions he'd written and crossed out. Silence settled over the room like snow. Joseph looked at Henry. Henry looked at Rena. Rena looked at Paul. "That's not good enough," she said quietly. "But it's honest. And maybe that's where we start." Paul nodded. He didn't trust his voice. "We're not making any promises," Rena continued. "But if the boys want to see you again, we'll arrange it. Supervised, structured, on their timeline." "Thank you," Paul managed. "Don't thank me," Rena said. "This isn't for you." They didn't hug. They didn't make promises. But they agreed to meet again. Paul wasn't forgiven, but he was seen. And sometimes that's the first step towards something that isn't quite redemption, but might be accountability. 3 weeks later, everything fell apart. The bill was introduced on a Thursday. By Friday, Fisher Youth Health was on every news channel in the country, and by Monday, Paul was being called a monster. State Bill 4427, Protecting Minors from Experimental Gender Procedures Act. The title sounded reasonable, protective, concerned. That was the point. The reality was a ban. Total and absolute. No gender-affirming care for anyone under 18. No puberty blockers. No hormone therapy. No surgeries. No exceptions. Not for children who'd been in therapy for years. Not for teenagers who'd socially transitioned. Not for families who'd done everything right. If passed, Fisher Youth Health would be forced to close its doors. Paul got the call from his legal team at 7 in the morning. He was in his office, reviewing patient files, by number, always by number, when his phone buzzed. "We have 60 days, his attorney said, without preamble. "Then it goes to vote. What are our options? Testify at the public hearing. Rally support. Hope we can flip enough votes. But Paul, I'll be honest, the political climate right now isn't in our favor." Everything Paul built was about to be destroyed, and this time he couldn't run. By Friday afternoon, Paul's face was on every news outlet. Conservative pundits called him a predator. "He's mutilating children," one said, leaning into the camera with rehearsed outrage. "Profiting off confusion, destroying families." Progressive advocates called him a hero. "He's our only defense," a pediatrician said on a rival network. "Without Fisher Youth Health, these kids have nowhere to go." Paul was scheduled to testify at the public hearing in 6 days. The lead sponsor of the bill was Senator Marcia Holt. Silver hair, styled perfectly. Smooth voice that made cruelty sound like compassion. She called herself a mother protecting mothers. In a press conference that went viral, she stood at a podium flanked by parents who claimed the clinic had stolen their children. Her voice was steady, measured, devastating. Children cannot consent to permanent changes. Their brains aren't developed enough to make these decisions. And clinics like Fisher Youth Health are profiting off their confusion. We're not banning health care. We're protecting childhood. Paul watched the press conference from his office. His hands shook so badly, he had to set his coffee down before he spilled it. She was good, terrifyingly good. She didn't sound hateful. She sounded concerned, reasonable, like someone who genuinely cared about children's well-being. And that made her dangerous. Rena saw the news on her lunch break. She was in the teacher's lounge at the community center where she worked part-time, heating up leftover pasta, when the TV on the wall showed Paul's face and the words "Gender Clinic Under Fire." She pulled out her phone, dialed the number she'd saved 3 weeks ago but hadn't used since. Paul answered on the second ring. "Rena, are you testifying?" "Yes." "So am I." Silence on the other end. "Rena, you don't have to. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because if that clinic closes, kids like ours have nowhere to go, and I won't let that happen." "Thank you," Paul said quietly. "Don't thank me," Rena replied, echoing her words from 3 weeks ago. "This isn't about you. This is about every child who needs that building to stay open." That night, Joseph and Henry sat Rena down at the kitchen table. The same table where she'd told them about Paul. The same table where they'd made the decision to meet him. "We want to testify too," Joseph said. "No," Rena said immediately. "Absolutely not." "Mom," Joseph continued, voice firm, "if we don't speak, they'll keep pretending we don't exist. They'll keep talking about us like we're confused or broken or too young to know ourselves. We have to show them we're real." "You'll be attacked," Rena warned, heart hammering. "People will say horrible things. Your faces will be on the news. Your names will be public. You can't take that back." "They already do," Henry said softly. "At least this time, I get to say something back." Rena looked at both of her sons, 13 years old, still babies in so many ways, but also warriors, braver than she'd ever been. She closed her eyes, tried to find an argument that would convince them, tried to find the parental authority to say no and make it stick, but she knew she couldn't stop them. And more than that, she knew she shouldn't. "If you do this," she said slowly, "we do it together. All three of us. And if it gets to be too much, we leave. Deal?" "Deal," Joseph said. Henry nodded. In 3 days, all four of them would stand in front of a legislative committee and tell the truth. But the truth doesn't always win. Sometimes it just makes you a target. Paul called Rena that weekend. "I heard Joseph and Henry are testifying." "They are. I tried to talk them out of it." "I'm glad you didn't succeed," Paul said. "The committee needs to see them, hear them, not as statistics or case studies, as people." "Paul, if this backfires, if they get hurt because of this—" "I know," he interrupted. "I know what's at stake. For all of us." The hearing was set for Monday, 9 a.m. Paul prepared testimony, rewrote it 17 times, each version trying to balance clinical expertise with personal confession. Rena prepared armor, another blazer, another necklace, another mask of calm she didn't feel. Joseph prepared art, the self-portrait he'd submitted with his intake, the one that showed him becoming visible. Henry prepared poetry, the body as a rented room, words he'd written in the dark and would now speak in the light. And across the state, people who had never met them prepared rage. Senator Holt scheduled her own testimony. News crews reserved spots in the chamber. Parent groups organized protests outside the Capitol building. Social media filled with hashtags, some supportive, most vicious. The night before, Paul couldn't sleep. Again. He sat in his office and thought about Danny, about promises made at gravesides, about the difference between building monuments and being present, about the possibility that everything he'd worked for could end in a single vote. Rena couldn't sleep either. She checked on Joseph and Henry 3 times, stood in their doorway, watching them breathe, wondered if she was making the right choice, letting them do this. Wondered if there was a right choice at all. Joseph and Henry lay awake in their shared room, staring at the ceiling, rehearsing words they hoped would matter. Paul walked to the microphone knowing this might be the last time anyone listened. So he told the truth. All of it. The chamber was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the back wall, news cameras in designated spots, red lights blinking, the air thick with anticipation and hostility in equal measure. Paul's hands gripped the podium, wood grain under his palms. Microphone adjusted too high. He lowered it with shaking fingers. Camera flashes erupted. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Senator Marcia Holt sat front and center at the elevated committee table, leaning forward slightly, skeptical, already prepared to dismiss whatever he said. Paul cleared his throat, began. "My name is Paul Fisher. I'm the founder and CEO of Fisher Youth Health. 15 years ago, I walked away from a woman I loved because I was afraid of failing as a father. She was pregnant with twins. I chose my career. I chose this clinic. I abandoned my children before they were born. Gasps. Actual audible gasps. Heads turning. Whispers spreading like wildfire. Paul didn't stop. 3 months ago, their files crossed my desk. I didn't know they existed. But when I read their stories, when I saw that both of them are transgender, I realized something. I've spent 15 years trying to save children like mine, but I never stayed for my own. I built monuments to my guilt. This clinic is one of them. The room went silent. The kind of silence that has weight. If you shut down Fisher Youth Health, you won't be punishing me. You'll be punishing every child who doesn't fit into the boxes you've built for them. You'll be punishing my sons, and they've already been punished enough by a world that refuses to see them, and by a father who refused to stay. Paul stepped down. His legs felt unsteady. The room erupted, shouting, some supportive, some enraged. Senator Holt banged her gavel twice. "Order," she commanded. Rena approached next. Navy blazer, silver necklace, spine straight. She placed her hands on either side of the podium and looked directly into the committee. "My name is Rena Emmons. I raised twin sons alone for 13 years. When they told me they were transgender, I didn't understand it at first. But I listened. And what I heard was this. They weren't confused. They were clear. Clearer than most adults I know." She shifted her gaze directly to Senator Holt. Eye contact. Unflinching. "You say you're protecting children, but you're not protecting mine. You're erasing them. This clinic gave my sons language for who they are. It gave them safety. It gave them hope. If you take that away, you're not saving anyone. You're just making sure kids like mine suffer in silence." Rena stepped down. No tremor, no hesitation. Pure, controlled fury, wrapped in composure. Joseph stood, walked to the podium carrying something flat and canvas-backed. He held up a painting. A self-portrait split down the middle. Left side shadowed, blurred, features indistinct and fading into gray. Right side bold, reds and oranges and electric blues, eyes wide open, face clear and present and alive. "This is me before I had words for who I am," Joseph said, pointing to the left side. His voice was steady, louder than Rena's, filled with the particular confidence of someone who'd stopped apologizing for existing. "And this is me now," pointing to the right. "You want to take away the clinic that helped me paint the right side. You want to tell me I'm too young to know who I am. But I've always known. I just needed someone to believe me." He set the painting against the podium, propped so the committee could see it clearly. "Don't take that away from kids who come after me." Some people in the audience were crying. A woman in the third row wiping her eyes with a tissue. A man in the back with his hand over his mouth. Others sat stone-faced, arms crossed, unmoved or unwilling to be moved. Senator Holt wrote notes on a legal pad. Her expression gave nothing away. Henry stepped forward. He unfolded a piece of paper from his pocket, creased from being folded and refolded, carried with him for days. His voice was quiet when he spoke, but the chamber had gone silent enough that every word carried. "I wrote this poem the night before my first appointment at Fisher Youth Health. It's called The Body as a Rented Room," he read. "I live in a house I did not choose, with walls that do not fit my shape. I rearrange the furniture daily, but the foundation remains wrong. I do not hate this house. I simply know it was meant for someone else. And if you tell me I must stay here, that I'm too young to know where I belong, then you are telling me to be a guest in my own skin. Forever." The silence that followed was absolute. No coughs, no shuffling, just Henry's words hanging in the air like something sacred. He folded the paper carefully, put it back in his pocket. "This clinic didn't change who I am. It gave me permission to be who I've always been. If you close it, you're telling kids like me that we don't deserve that permission, that we have to stay guests in our own bodies. Forever. He stepped down. The room remained silent. Even the protesters in the back seemed momentarily stunned into stillness. Senator Holt cleared her throat, adjusted her microphone. Thank you for your testimony. The committee will deliberate. Cold, professional, clinical, like she'd just heard a weather report instead of 4 people laying their lives bare. But behind her, a younger senator, a woman Paul didn't recognize, was wiping her eyes. Another committee member stared at Joseph's painting, still propped against the podium. The vote would happen in 2 weeks. Paul didn't know if they'd won, but for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't running. He was staying. And Joseph and Henry had just told the world who they were, not despite their father's failures, but in defiance of them. Stories like this, where people stand up and say, I exist and I matter, they change things. Maybe not immediately, maybe not perfectly, but they plant seeds. If this story moved you, if Joseph and Henry's courage reminded you of your own, leave a comment telling me what you would have said if you had a microphone. And please, share this. Someone needs to hear it today. The vote came down to one person. The bill failed. By a single vote. Fisher Youth Health would stay open, but Paul Fisher would never be the same. 2 weeks after the hearing, they watched the live stream together. Paul's office. The 4 of them crowded around a laptop on his desk. Rena to the left, Joseph and Henry standing behind them. Paul's finger hovered over the trackpad, volume turned up. The vote was called. 26-25. The bill failed. Joseph exhaled so hard his whole body seemed to deflate. Henry closed his eyes, head dropping forward. Rena put her head in her hands, shoulders shaking. Not crying, just releasing tension she'd been holding for weeks. Paul didn't move, just stared at the screen. It's over, Rena said finally. No, Paul replied quietly. It's just beginning. They'll try again, and we'll have to fight again. Then we will, Joseph said. 6 months later, life had settled into something that wasn't normal, but wasn't crisis either. Paul attended Joseph's first art show, a small gallery downtown, white walls, track lighting, 20 pieces from local teenage artists. Joseph's self-portrait, the one he'd held up at the hearing, displayed in the center. Paul stood in the back. Didn't introduce himself as Dad to anyone who asked. Just watched Joseph move through the room, confident and animated, explaining his work to strangers who looked at him like he was someone worth listening to. The self-portrait sold to a private collector for $3,000. Joseph found Paul afterward, still standing by the back wall. You came, Joseph said. I did. Why? Paul thought for a moment. Because you made something beautiful, and I wanted to see it. Joseph nodded. Not a smile, not forgiveness, just acknowledgement. It's not forgiveness, but it's presence. 2 weeks after that, Henry performed at a youth open mic. A coffee shop with mismatched chairs and a small stage barely big enough for one person. Rena and Paul sat together in the back row. Not touching, but together. Henry stepped up to the microphone, unfolding a new poem from his pocket. This one's called The Father I Never Met. Reprise, he said. He read, I thought you were a ghost. A question mark in the shape of a man. But you are not a ghost. You are a coward who became accountable. You are not my hero. But you are here. And maybe that is enough. For now. Applause filled the small room. Paul was crying, silent tears he didn't bother wiping away. Rena handed him a tissue without looking at him, her eyes still on Henry at the microphone. He's extraordinary, Paul whispered. I know, Rena replied. After the performance, they sat in Rena's car, in the parking lot. Joseph and Henry inside the venue, talking with other performers, laughing about something Paul couldn't hear. "I don't expect forgiveness," Paul said. "Good," Rena replied, "because this isn't about you." Pause. Engine off. Just the two of them in the dark. "But they're letting you stay." Paul nodded. "Why?" he asked. "Because they chose to. Not because you deserve it, but because they want to know you. Or at least, they want to try." Paul looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in 15 years. "And you?" Rena thought for a long moment. "I don't forgive you," she said clearly. "I don't think I ever will. You abandoned me when I needed you most. You chose ambition over love. And that's not something I can just let go." Silence. "But," she continued, "I respect what you've built. The clinic matters. The work matters. And if you showing up for Joseph and Henry means they feel more whole, then I can tolerate you being around." Paul smiled sadly. "That's more than I deserve." "It is," Rena agreed. She reached into her bag, pulled out an envelope. Old, yellowed at the edges. The settlement check. 15 years old. Never cashed. "I don't want this," she said. "I never did." Paul took it, looked at it for a moment. His signature, her name, an amount that meant nothing compared to what it was supposed to buy. He tore it in half. "Neither do I." 1 year later. Joseph's 14th birthday. Henry's 14th birthday. A small party at Rena's house. Balloons. Cake. A handful of friends from school. Paul was invited. He brought gifts. Sketchbooks for Joseph. Professional grade, the kind real artists use. Leather-bound journals for Henry. Pages thick enough for fountain pen ink. They blew out candles together. Paul didn't sing loudly, didn't take center stage. Just stood to the side and watched, voice barely audible under everyone else's. After cake, Henry approached him by the kitchen counter. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything?" "Do you regret it? Leaving?" Paul didn't hesitate. "Every single day." Henry nodded. "Good. You should." Paul smiled through tears. "You're right." Henry paused. Then, "But you're here now, and that's something." That night, Paul sat alone in his car outside Rena's house. He could see through the living room window, Joseph and Henry laughing with their mom. Rena's hands gesturing as she told some story. All three of them together in warm yellow light. He was not part of that circle. He may never be. But he could see it. And maybe, after years of running, seeing is enough. Paul Fisher built an empire for children he never knew. And in the end, the children he abandoned taught him the only lesson that mattered. That showing up isn't the same as saving. That presence isn't redemption. That accountability means staying even when you're not forgiven. Even when you're not welcomed. Even when all you get to do is witness. Today, Fisher Youth Health is still open. Paul still runs it, but he no longer speaks at every event. He's learned to step back. Joseph is 15 now. His artwork has been featured in 2 galleries. He's started a youth advocacy group. Henry is 15. He's published poems in 3 literary journals. He's writing a memoir. Rena is still their fortress, still their North Star. And Paul? He shows up. To art shows, to poetry readings, to birthdays. He doesn't lead. He listens. And slowly, carefully, he's learning what it means to be a father. Not the one he imagined, but the one they'll allow. Some legacies are built in boardrooms. Others are built in living rooms. Paul spent 30 years building the first. He'll spend the rest of his life earning the second. And maybe that's the real story. Not redemption, but reckoning. Not heroism, but humanity. Not perfection, but presence. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you that it's never too late to show up, even when you don't deserve to, subscribe to this channel. We tell stories about people who fail, who try again, who learn the hard way. That love isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. And if someone in your life needs to hear that today, share this video with them, because sometimes the story someone else needs is the one you just finished. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.